Hi, everybody. I'm Victoria Ybanez, and I work at Redwind Consulting. We are a national tribal technical assistance provider working with the Office on Violence Against Women, more specifically with the Grants to Tribal Governments program. And in my past experience, I've been involved in the development of a couple of transitional housing programs and a shelter for Native women, developing them literally from the ground up in terms of acquiring the property that's needed for those programs, as well as the program development and design. And so with that, I have a lot of experience working with a range of different challenging issues. And this particular topic is one that I think is one of our more, well, I shouldn't say one is more critically important than another, but this, as we think about our work in addressing violence against Indigenous women, that women come with a range of different issues and challenges, as well as bringing families along. A lot of times we talk about the victims and the survivors, but there are also challenging issues that come as a result of the entire household. So we're working with people who have real life situations. A lot of times we think, oftentimes when we think of who we're responding to, a lot of times we think about it in a real singular aspect. We think of it as working with a victim of domestic violence or working with a survivor of sexual assault. And the reality is that those that we're working with are much more than that. And with that have complex lives and complex challenges. And when we're working with them in our program, we have this very limited opportunity to really help make a difference in terms of helping them to unravel some of the challenges that they're faced with, as well as lay a foundation to create the changes that they'd like to see in their lives. And so when I think about this, that people have like a right moment where they themselves recognize something that's happening in their lives and are trying to do something different about that, as well as the resources, the support, opportunity, all of those pieces are converging at the right time where people can actually make significant life transformation changes. And as staff, we often have an opportunity to help facilitate and support that. And sometimes as staff, we might even be a problem and one of the barriers to prevent that. And so it's important for us to recognize our role as staff as we're working with this limited window. And so like when I think about that in terms of some of the challenging issues, one of the ones that I've worked with a lot, as well as here a lot of programs struggling with, has to do with women who are abusing alcohol, or they themselves may be alcoholic or chronic alcoholics, or maybe substance abusing or addicted to substances. I've also seen where people are working through some real rage as a result of what's happened in their lives. And I think, you know, to some degree it's a process of time, but while we're working with them, it may feel like there's an awful lot of rage going on. And then a range of other kinds of unhealthy behaviors that people have picked up, and we're using it as a tool to survive some really dangerous situations, and have continued to use those tools that help them get through those difficult times that maybe aren't the best tools to keep using in their lives today. Some other things have to do with you know, like in terms of thinking of households and families, people that have been homeless or without housing or stable housing for a period of time, or living in crisis period for a period of time, have lost the ability to create structures within their households and oftentimes even providing the kind of consistent, steady, kind of stable parenting that is supportive of children. And then children themselves might also get lost in the process. And in that getting lost may come acting out of some of the behaviors they've seen, whether it's becoming somewhat invisible or going to the other extreme of maybe being real aggressive and acting out behaviors. And then the reality of, as I say, that people come with these complex lives, then you mix that with real life health issues, education issues, economic issues, and all of that. And then the other thing that I think is important for us to think about as staff people is to recognize some of the identities that we ourselves might have a personal struggle or challenge with. For instance, thinking about maybe someone who has been used in prostitution, if we haven't done enough personal work on that topic, we may have some ways that we're struggling with some judgment about what we see as this person's choices, and then also even some challenges around people's religious identities or faith identities, as well as sexual orientations and identities, such as gay, lesbian, or transgender. So when we think, one of the things I want to talk about a little bit is about multiple and repeat incidents of violence. And so when we look at our program, when we think about a shelter or a transitional housing program working with victims, one of the things that I hear a lot from is that people, sometimes are not really clear and understanding on why someone stays in a relationship that's been abusive. A lot of times I'll hear people will say something like, it would only take one time being hit and I'd be out of there in a minute, or I wouldn't take that, just one incident, I'm out of there. And so there's this judgment, and a lot of times it's a community judgment that plays out. And with that, then staff are influenced by that in terms of how they view somebody who's stayed in a relationship for a longer period of time, or who have been seeking multiple services as a result of repeat incidences. And then when I say the community attitude, one of the things that also plays out, we might even have pressure from tribal leadership or department heads to limit the amount of time that we serve somebody because of that. Because they think that, she should have gotten out after that first time, and why are we serving somebody that stayed around and made it so difficult? And so just a brief refresher, I know many of you are really clear about this, but just a brief refresher to just remind people that survivors, they don't cause the violence that they experience, that is something external to them that's being forced onto them. And a lot of times it's easier to look from the outside and think about, well, if only, she would pack up, if only she would have gotten out that time, without really being able to see the reality. Sometimes maybe staying in a relationship, she's actually keeping herself alive. We know from experience from some of the studies and research that's been done over time that potential lethality, the risk for lethality significantly increases when a victim of domestic violence makes a decision to leave a relationship or actually leaves the relationship. So sometimes that staying longer is really trying to manage some of that lethality risk. So there's a lot going on there beyond the surface of what we're seeing. And the pressure that we get from the community sometimes influences us as staff and impacts our decisions in terms of the way that we work. And so we want to really keep in mind, thinking about what would be a problematic program response, and that when we start to limit the services that we offer a survivor, a victim based on these notions of she should have gotten out sooner, or, we're going to say that 3 times accessing the services is enough, that what we're basically doing is we're starting to shut down the very resources when things are escalating and getting worse. I remember one time I was actually doing a training, and we had a focus group of women who were still dealing with their abusers, and a few that had just recently gotten out. And we talked about, we asked them some questions about what was some of the most difficult challenges they were faced with. And they talked about that the level of frustration that staff had, that they were working with, they could feel that. And they even over time, there was a way that staff treated them different. The more they asked for help, the more things shut down or were treated a little bit more disrespectfully. And then when we did that focus group, we also interviewed a couple law enforcement officers, and they talked about their frustration about why isn't she getting out, and why do we keep going to the same place, and talked about that when they would get a call that they even started kind of dragging their feet because it was the same old thing, same old story. And when you look at the two together, so the women were also saying that things were getting increasingly more dangerous. And then you hear what the practitioners are saying, and they're saying, well, we're frustrated and we're not giving it our all. So the reality is that those who are tasked with being the most strong resource for victims, that they themselves were actually backing out at a time that was more dangerous. And so when we think about that in transitional housing and emergency shelter, we really want to think about our practices and how we're working with survivors who are repeat service recipients. So one of the things clearly for transitional housing is that if someone comes into the program and then leaves, they have the ability to come into the program up to a maximum of 24 months. So if they came in like 2 times or 3 times, they still have that amount of time to come in for 24 months within the guidelines of OVW grants. And I would always encourage programs to have some other funding source that can go beyond any kind of limit like that. There might be that household that, for whatever reasons, might need that extra few months beyond the 24 months. In very limited situations, OVW can extend that, but it has to be a special request to be able to make that happen. If you have some additional funds to support you, it allows you to be able to really be more flexible with this. The other thing that I think is really important is for people to really have a relationship, build the communication to really help a staff person to get a better understanding of what is going on, so that their advocacy can be different. How you're going to advocate with somebody with a first point of contact may be different than somebody that you have a bigger understanding of what's going on. And instead of, because you've worked with them, that you back off, that you actually engage in a different way and maybe more involved to be more effective to help recognize the risks of lethality. So thinking about all of these different challenging issues, another one that's really huge and comes up quite a bit has to do with addressing alcohol and drug abuse. And I always think of this as really a tricky area. And part of why I say that is because there's a lot of pressure on the program on how the program should be responding. And there's also pressure coming from another side of how the program, like maybe through the funding source or other values on what kind of rules should be in place, what kind of ways that we work with somebody who's alcohol or drug dependent or alcohol or drug abusing. And so in that, we might have pressure from tribal leadership or department heads, or even the program manager within the tribal program, saying we really need to have some drug testing or some alcohol testing to get a handle on this, or we've got enough of a problem in our community with alcohol and drugs that we want to do a regular screening to make sure we're really working closely at it. And sometimes staff have a strong belief around that as well. And so there's a lot of challenges with that. One of the things I just want to point out is that a lot of times, a victim of domestic violence, a survivor of sexual assault, may pick up alcohol or drug use as a coping mechanism. I'm not saying that that's a healthy behavior. I'm just acknowledging this as a fact. And I know in the reality of some of the women I've worked with over the years, there have been women who have told me that if I stop drinking, I may kill myself. And so knowing that and knowing how they're using it as a coping mechanism, it goes back to what I said about it being tricky. Because we really want to support people to move toward healthy behaviors, but we don't want to rip away coping tools so fast that we create risk for survivors and victims. The other thing has to do with, some of our communities, some of our reservations were dry reservations. And so being intoxicated becomes problematic as far as those people seeking help when it's actually an illegal situation. So one of the things that we come across quite a bit is a sexual assault victim who's been raped and on a dry reservation, but she was intoxicated, so then she's fearful of seeking assistance. And a lot of times people talk about it in terms of seeking assistance of, calling law enforcement, but it really often plays out in terms of seeking assistance in terms of many of the different services and supports that might be available to her had she not been using. So we really want to be aware of that. And as I think about that, I really want us to think about how are we then building the communication in a way that keeps people talking to us. So like when I think about somebody who is struggling with alcohol or drug use, I can come from one side and say, well, it's against the law to use illegal substances, or, if you're using around here, we're going to kick you out. What we end up doing by some of that is we force it underground. And so as we're working with a population, particularly in transitional housing where we have a longer stretch of time where we can be working with somebody, and they're in our program for a minimum of 6 months up to a maximum of 24 months. If we push that underground, they're not going to be reaching out to us and looking and exploring options and trying to figure out that they do have a problem and how to go about addressing this. Instead, they're going to spend more time trying to hide it, and we as staff may end up spending more time trying to enforce rules and become more of an enforcer as opposed to an advocate. So again, it's tricky. So I think the relationship is a really important part in there. And I often think about this one woman I worked with for several years in this one community. And she was somebody, I actually even had to ask her to leave our program because her alcohol use, when she was intoxicated, she was a pretty mean drunk. and she would get out of control, and trying multiple different efforts to work with her. We had to ask her to leave a couple times. So we brought her back. We didn't ask her to leave and then put her on a list and say, no, we'll never work with her. We worked with her again and again and again. And this one time, actually I was working a different job, and she tracked me down and asked me for some help meeting with a social worker related to some stuff with her children. And while we were waiting for the social worker to come, she told me, she said, you know what, Vicki, you are the only person in my life that never threw me away. And to me, that's a success. And when I think about the reality of her life and the experience of the multiple victimizations that she had and the multiple sexual assaults, that it was a really big coping mechanism for her. And she was one of the people who had told me, if I stop using this, I will probably kill myself because the pain is too big. And we tried multiple ways to support her in finding the supports that were available in the community. And she had periods of sobriety. And, like the first time of sobriety was probably like a month, and then the next time was a few months, and then it got longer. And the longest sobriety that I knew that she had was like 4 years. And that was awesome to know that she had 4 years of sobriety, and I think it was unrealistic, or would have been unrealistic for me to think that she would quit once and be done and be sober. So when I think about working with her as a staff person in domestic violence, sexual assault work, and working to address violence against women, I really want to have deeper conversations with her about how her using makes her more vulnerable to violence, and encourage her to try small steps to walking away from this coping mechanism. And I remember the first conversation I had with her, I asked her if she thought she had a problem, and she says, everybody drinks. I'm probably not any different than anybody else. And I said, well, if you don't really think you have a problem, do you think you could quit for a week? And she's like, oh, yeah, it's not a problem. And so we had this conversation about it, and I got her to agree that she would stop drinking for 1 week, and she didn't make it. So then it allowed me to be able to come back and say, if you can't quit for 1 week, that's a huge red flag here. Let's explore it some more. With that, as a staff person, working with women who have alcohol and drug problems, then it was critical for me to be educated on it. I am not an alcohol and drug counselor, and I don't want anybody to think that I am. I just have experience working with people who have alcohol and drug issues from within the context of working to address violence against Indian women. So one of the things that was important for me to do was to build a relationship with those trained professionals that are experienced with working with alcohol and drug problems. And not for me to just go to one training, but have them come and do in-service with our staff on a regular basis, so like maybe twice a year, having them come and talk with staff about different issues and different approaches and different things. We also worked with the narcotics department in our law enforcement and asked them to come and do some training with us also. And the piece that was important in there was that we didn't know enough about current drugs. And so it was important for us to have a staff to have an understanding of some of it, and so that we can recognize it from their point of view as well as from the chemical dependency counselor's point of view. So it gave us more information, and then we started to think about, so then how do we raise these questions and do that in a really respectful way. When I think about doing this work, I always think that at our core is that we work in a way that always represents and demonstrates love and respect. No matter how bad someone's behavior is, no matter how disrespectful they are to me, that my reaction back to them is always with love and respect. It may be very firm, but it always demonstrates love and respect. And so the one woman that I think, that I was telling you about, because I was really consistent with her and she didn't feel judged by me. Even though I probably had different judgments going on inside of me, I always was looking at how do I gently guide her to find her answers and to explore this as a potential problem for her and her children. And it really helped to give her the message that I would be there for her. Even when I was the person who had to kick her out of our program, tell her that we couldn't work with her right now as a program participant, we didn't shut her down from working with her in the community, but we weren't going to work with her in the housing because of the impact it was having. She still kept coming back to me because she never felt judged by me. And that is really huge. And I think that for us as staff people working in this work, we really want to challenge ourselves to think about how are we working in ways that build that kind of a relationship. And in that relationship, we can still have the very hard conversations. One of the things that I see that happens as we move toward creating rules, like what ends up happening is we move toward trying to rely on the rule as opposed to the relationship. And I know with OVW funding, OVW really wants us to come from an approach of really honoring and respecting an individual person's personal sovereignty and autonomy, so that they're making choices and decisions about the direction of their own life as opposed to the staff imposing it on them. And exploring alcohol and drug issues is a part of that autonomy, that it's their choice to put it down and walk away from it. As staff people then, we want to figure out and keep having the conversations of figure out how to gently guide them in the direction of putting in place healthier behaviors so that they can move toward sobriety in their own time and place. And our role as staff is to facilitate uncovering how it's harming them and helping them to see a better way for them as they get sober. We, in our transitional housing program that I've worked in, one of the things that we even did is that when people would go into chemical dependency treatment, we would work at holding their housing for them so that it didn't become a challenge for them to, like I'm going to end up homeless again or lose my housing, and that becomes this other huge barrier. And so then we were able to work it out to keep that in place for them and keep communicating with them while they were in treatment so that they came back and transitioned back into a stable situation. So this topic, this one particular topic, as well as this entire webinar, is one of those ones that could actually be a training that could take a much longer period of time. But I'm hoping that I'm opening up some thinking about some different approaches for you. So one of the other challenging areas that we see a lot of has to do with our interconnected relationships. And as we think about that, when we look at those interconnected relationships in our communities, that we are fairly tight-knit. It's very different than if we were in Denver and we're going to a non-native program where we have no connection to the staff people there and those that are making decisions. In our own tribal communities, it's not uncommon that we're going to end up having relationships playing itself out. And in those relationships, it could be that the person who is seeking services is related to the advocate. Or it could be that the abuser is related to a person who has significant authority in the program or over the program, or it could be, it could be a friend or a neighbor, someone we've grown up with, and so we have these tight interconnected relationships that are different than many non-native programs, and so in that, it's important for us to recognize those and then how they become problematic. And so some of it has to do with people believe there's preferential treatment could be going on, where, and actually I was talking with a program a couple of weeks ago about something similar where they were saying that they were serving somebody in the program and had, didn't believe they were doing anything preferential, but they were hearing some comments coming back, and it was coming back from some people in authority saying that there was concerns about preferential treatment serving this close connection within the program. Another way that it becomes really problematic are perceptions where people believe that persons of authority may interfere with what you're doing. And one of the consistent things where I see as interference is people want to know who's in that program, and where leadership has insisted on, give me a list of who's in that program and who's being served, and advocates will say, well, we know, this tribal leader who's making this request is connected in this way. So there's a lot of different challenges in terms of those relationships. And so what we want to do is we really want to think about, so how do we address that? And one of the things that I think is really important is we really want to have a policy and a procedure in place that can be responsive to it. Now, many of our programs are often small, and if we've got 4 staff, sometimes we feel like it's a luxury, whereas, some non-native programs have 10, 20, or more staff. So it's a whole different ballgame for them. But we want to really think about how are we going to be able to respond if there's a relationship. If I'm the lone advocate, what's my option if a family member is seeking help? And because we don't want to say, well, we won't serve them, because it's not fair by virtue of the fact that we happen to be involved in the program to cut out somebody else who is in our family and, they're dealing with some of the very same crisis that anyone else would deal with. So there's ways we can develop a response to that. I was working with a program earlier this year, and one of the things, and they had a lone advocate, and one of the things that we did was we talked about, well, how about your supervisor? They were housed under behavioral health, and they actually created a way that if the person who was seeking services was connected to that advocate, that they could pull into one of the social work staff from behavioral health. And what they did, it wasn't just about having a basic procedure, let's just pull that person in. It was about making sure that the options they were pulling in outside of the domestic violence program were actually trained in domestic violence so that they could be effective if they were working with somebody, and that they had some ability to reach out to resources. And so we talked about, so who else, if that behavioral health person needed to talk to someone else about how to be more effective in working with, say, the sister of the advocate, without going back to the advocate and talking about how do I work in this situation, which then discloses the sister stuff to the advocate. So they have a resource outside. Maybe it's reaching out to a non-native advocacy program nearby, or to the neighboring tribe that has a domestic violence program also, and using that as a peer support for that behavioral health person to problem solve, or reaching out to your tribal coalition as well as even your TA providers to talk through some of these challenging issues. so that there was a resource in place that could respond to that. So you really want to have some clear policies and procedures in place that provide guidance to make sure that the response is pretty solid, so that, as I said before, that a population doesn't get excluded. And I see on the list of attendees, Ruth Oja is on the line, and I just want to say a piece, and Ruth, if you feel like piping in, please do that, because a few years back we were talking about a situation around tribal leadership asking for information about who, breaching confidentiality, putting advocates in that position to do that. And Ruth talked about how she would go to tribal leadership and educate them about their policies. And so she was being real proactive in the approach, as opposed to waiting for them to come and put her on the spot. She was involved in educating her tribal leadership about the policies they approved and why those were important. So when that request came in to breach confidentiality, she was able to come back and say, you're asking me to break the policies that you put in place. Ruth, did you want to pipe in and say anything about that? Well, I know I'm putting her on the spot, and sometimes people are listening in different ways. So anyway, I thought it was brilliant as an approach in terms of really making sure that you're being proactive as leadership is working at getting involved. Ruth? That was funny. I saw a little microphone pipe up right beside her name. Anyway, so I'll just move on from there. So anyway, it's important to really be as proactive as possible. And so one of the things when I think about this is that, there's a lot of ways that we can think about these situations to some degree in advance. So we want to brainstorm what are the hard situations we're dealing with. And there's a lot of similarities across programs that I've worked with, but there's also some distinctive differences that each program works with and unique ways things are playing it out. It may be the same broad issue, but it plays out different in our own community. And so you'll want to brainstorm those. So like if you have a time and there's not something right pressing in front of you, sit down with, amongst the staff, whether it's one or two or three people, or, if it's fortunate to have a larger staff, to sit down together and brainstorm those hard situations you're dealing with, and then group those that are common to each other. So, you might be talking about, alcohol issues in one way, and then you might come back and talk about alcohol issues in another way. And so you start to find that there's the common theme has to do with alcohol use. And then you might find that another common theme has to do with, what you see as maybe parenting styles that are abusive or neglectful. So you want to group those together and then start thinking about some what-if scenarios. So as you've grouped and identified some of those, then you start to figure out, so like what are some of the ways they play out? So what if, my sister came and applied for the program? How would we deal with that to make sure my sister got just as good a service as everybody else? Or what if our department head wanted us to do a staffing with alcohol and drug program because they were all under the same roof with behavioral health or without assigned release, and some things like that. And so then as we start to think about those what-if scenarios, then we want to start identifying how would we respond to that. So as we think, so what if it's my sister? How would I respond to that? If it's somebody that I went to high school with, but I haven't, really had any contact with for, say, the last 10 years, assuming they're quite a bit younger. But so then how would I do that maybe different than if it was my sister? So we want to think about it with some variation. And so then as we start to think about how we want to respond, describe your ideal. In a perfect world, what would it look like? Then start building up your response toward that ideal. So the ideal might be, if you've got someone who's dealing with alcohol and drug treatment, is that you might have a conversation with them and take them over to alcohol and drug, and they get into the treatment, and they get alcohol and drugs, professionals that are working and supporting them while they're in treatment, and you've done, cross-training with alcohol and drug treatment professionals to understand domestic violence and sexual assault issues within the context of safety and the work that they're doing. So that might be the ideal. But the reality is you've got someone who refuses to acknowledge that they have an alcohol problem or denies that they have a drug problem. So then you start thinking about, so then what? So you have your ideal, and then you build up to that in terms of your responses. And then the other thing, and people that know me, I think role-playing is a really excellent tool. So, and I know a lot of people, actually, when I say, well, let's do a role play, people will roll their eyes and resist and just get into all kinds of ways because they don't like it. And I personally don't like being asked to role play, so I will acknowledge that truthfully. But I also acknowledge that when I do role play, I learn a lot from it. And when I use it as a tool, it actually helps us develop the experience we might not have. So if we don't think we're really good in terms of being able to talk about alcohol and drug issues with somebody around safety, then role-playing it out with another staff a few times gives us some experience to draw from when we're faced with the situation. We have to respond right off the top of our head on our feet without much preparation. So role-playing is a really excellent tool. The other thing that I think is really a critical piece as we think about how we work in terms of the responses that we have is that if we have an opportunity to take on hard issues working in twos, it's really important to do that. And so if you're going to sit down and talk to somebody about some, like out-of-control behavior or parental neglect or, that we believe you're, crack dealing or something like that, those are some of the hard conversations. I would prefer to have somebody beside me, a staff person who can back me up. Now, if I'm the primary person working with that individual, I may be the one that needs to take the lead in that conversation, but I may hit a point where I might be slightly at a loss for words. So having a second person in there will be able to fill that loss for words if I'm missing a piece, as well as being able to hear a lot of things in a way that, if I'm leading it, may not catch and observe all of the different kind of subtleties that play out in that kind of a conversation. So having that second person would be enormously helpful. If I'm going into a meeting with somebody on something difficult like that, and I've got a second person with me, I need to have a pre-meeting with them so we're really clear about what we are covering, what we're intending to cover, how do we wrap it up, because we don't want to go in and over-belabor a point either. And so that we really go in, really cooperating with each other. So I just want to offer a few of those strategies for you. And so as you think about your policy that goes with everything, really go through and write things out. So what are those challenging areas? Write out that list that I mentioned that you brainstormed. What makes this a challenging issue for the shelter and transitional housing program? So get clear about that. And then what's the intent behind the policy? Why are you going to create a policy about this? What do you want the policy to accomplish? And what are some of the steps? So you start moving towards some of the protocol pieces to address the challenging issues, and what resources will help you address this challenging issue. And along the way, as you think about the resources, you might have within your tribe, you might have a really solid, variety of different programs that can help you. You might have professionals that can help you with if you've got suicide issues going on within your program, or if you've got, heavy chemical use, parenting, support and those kinds of things. Use them. They are going to help enhance your capacity to work with the complex issues that people are dealing with. So I think it's a really good idea to do kind of cross-training. So if I'm going to work with chemical dependency, I can have them come in and do some in-services, but for my program, I can also go and do in-services with their program. And so it becomes a mutual benefit. And so in that, when we think about how we work with each other, we want to have the relationships with the programs that are available, as well as know, who's going to be that person. So if I'm working with chemical dependency, who is that person in chemical dependency who's going to be one of the better responders? So there might be 2 people in the chemical dependency program or 4 people in that program, and one of them is really strong and solid in working with victims of domestic violence, or another one might be stronger with sexual assault. So I want to make sure as I'm bridging that connection for that survivor that I'm working with, that they're getting to the right person. And sometimes I can even, help bridge that conversation for that person in our program by actually helping to set up the meeting if they've reached that point and they're ready to go, and go with them for that first meeting. There have been times, like there was this one woman I was working with, and she had wanted some help with some financial stuff and managing her finances and budgeting, and I had just taken her to the food shelf, and I was driving her back to the program, back to her home, and as we were driving, she brings up, she says, I think I've got an alcohol problem. And so instead of continuing to drive and being distracted because I had to focus on the road, I pulled over to the shoulder, and we sat on the shoulder, parked, and we talked in the car for about an hour and a half. And it was an important piece for me to stop in the moment. She opened it up. I needed to take advantage of that little window. If I would have continued driving and dealing with that and getting back too soon, I would have interrupted the flow. So it was important to take that time and that opportunity. So there's a lot more that I can say in different ways, and I just really want to just stop here and give people an opportunity to ask some questions and share some comments so that we can, so that I can hear from you all as well to see what's more important for you. And I do see in the chat that Ruth did respond, and she says she's new to webinars. And so she wasn't quite sure on how to communicate when I brought her up. But she says, but you are right, prevention is sometimes the best cure. We started very early to educate our council and other response programs. And I do, listening to Ruth when she's talked about it in the past, I know she's done some awesome work proactively, getting out there, making sure people are educated, So then you can pull that information that they already know and remind them that, you developed this policy. Remember, this is why this policy is important, and this is why we're not going to share this information with you because at your request. Also, Clara says, how about a client who was released from the shelter due to multiple rule infractions, then request to return in a couple weeks? Does anyone have experience with this? Does it require a policy and examples? One of the things about asking someone to leave because of multiple infractions, I've seen shelters where they basically said, they've had people where they've come in and it's continued to be problematic, and then after a few times coming in to the shelter and continuing to do the same infractions, they put them on a list and say, nope, we're not working with you. And I actually disagree with that approach. I do think that there are times that you ask somebody to leave the program because it's not working out, and it's necessary to take that type of a position. But even a few weeks later, things could change. And we don't know what's happened in between this time and the last time. And when somebody would come into the program, I would ask, I would remind them that when you were here before, we had these challenges and that we have the same expectations, and, it could end up being the same result. So, again, going back to that relationship building, so that people actually we keep the door open so that people can come to the program because they're seeking safety and seeking assistance to address domestic violence or sexual assault in their lives. And I would hate to say, no, you can't come because, you weren't doing what you were supposed to do last time, and then this next time they were killed. I don't know that I could live with that in my conscience. I would much rather bring them in the program, have the same infractions happen, and have to ask them to leave again. And that's what when I started off talking about the repeat incidents of violence and those people that keep coming back into our program multiple times, that it wears us down as staff people, and sometimes we think, like, what's the point? At one point years ago, we were looking at people seeking shelter assistance, and at that time, before they left the relationship, and at that time it was an average of 8 times before they left the relationship. Not to say everybody came 8 times. Some people get out of a relationship or things change within the first or second time, and some people it takes much longer. I'm just saying that, we should prepare ourselves for the multiple returns. And in the midst of it, there are, one of the things in terms of living with chaos and behavior, or chaos and crisis, is that skills break down, and we don't often realize how rapidly that happens. Myself, personally, I got into this work as a former victim of domestic violence, and I was homeless for 6 months. And as a result of that, when I finally got housing, I didn't know how to clean the house. I used to be pretty immaculate as a housekeeper. I'm a little less so today, but back then, when I got housing right after that stretch of homelessness, I didn't know how to care for my house, and I was always burning a roast, it seemed like. And there were other types of skills that broke down, and trying to figure out, how do I pull this parenting off? How do I clean this house? How do I manage all these things? And I was still dealing with protection order and an ex-husband who was stalking me. And I share that as an example because a lot of times in our programs, we have a community living situation, and we have some rules in place to try to manage that community living situation. But what it doesn't account for as well is the reality of how things have broken down for people as they've been living with chaos and crisis. The other piece that plays out in there to some degree is anger and rage. And so we also have people who are in different stages of dealing with and processing some of the injustices that have happened to them. And that in itself also makes it even more challenging. So you've got someone who's not a good parent and they're screaming at the kids all the time, their kids and maybe other kids, and and haven't cleaned up their space, and maybe they're an alcoholic and they've snuck alcohol in. So we will expect infractions of our rules, and then what in that expectation, going back to that piece about how do we do this with love and respect, and recognize, how do we gently guide people to recognize that this isn't helpful, this is problematic, and this is making things harder in your life, how, helping to support them in ways to change that behavior. Clara also mentioned, does it require a policy and examples? So I just gave some examples of some different pieces in there. In terms of a policy, I think it's really hard to have a policy. I think more so it would be a protocol. I think the important piece is that we serve everybody. If they are in need of safety, that's the intent of shelter. Emergency shelter is to provide emergency safety or immediate safety. So then we want to just respond to everybody that we have the capacity to serve. So more so would be the procedure. What if we have somebody who we had asked to leave? What would it be how would our procedure change as we were intaking them? And so we would add the additional piece of reminding them of what happened, and that if, the same behaviors and same things happened, it could result in the same result. So we would just want to add that piece in the procedure. Ruth has a comment in here, and she says, we are now developing a transitional housing and supportive housing complex that will work with individuals on their personal strengths and will have the goal of independence from the program, but with the understanding that if it took you 25 years to ask for help, you will take more than the traditional 15 or 30-day stay to get on your feet. People come to our program with their survival and coping skills. We have to understand that our programs are also scary and they do not know what will happen next. We are a kind and gentle type of programming, but they don't know that. The 7 grandfather teachings help us to stay humble, but we can't expect that people walking through the door are humble until they identify that in themselves. Exactly, that is so true. There's one woman I worked with who, through her personal experiences, when I was working with her, she was a very angry person, and every time I had to work with her, I was a little bit afraid of her because she yelled so much. And one thing I wouldn't say never, but one thing I tried to avoid doing with her was telling her to, stop and control it. I would listen to her, and then I would talk about, and respond to what she was saying, and then I would try to find other points in time to talk to her about her anger. And one of the things that she did was she went to her traditional teachings, and actually she became a Madei. She was an Anishinaabe woman and participated in the Madei Wind Lodge. And through the work that she did with the Madei, was able to reclaim her gentle spirit, and to know her even a year later from where she started from was vastly different, and it requires a lot of patience on our part. This one friend of mine, she talks about patience, power, or patience, passion, and persistence. And in terms of thinking about ours as a person doing this work, that it requires a lot of patience on our part, a passion on our part to motivate us to keep doing what we do, and persistence. So if I have a conversation with one person about some of the behavior and ways that their behavior is problematic for them, having one conversation isn't enough. I need to find multiple ways to help illuminate that to them so that they can see themselves and identify it for themselves, and to take the personal steps when they're ready to build what they want in their lives. Are there any other comments or questions? Is there like a push card or something like I could put the boxes? And just to remind you that you can raise your hand at the top of the screen with the little person with the arm up. You can click on that to raise your hand and we can call on you, or you can type in the chat box. Well, I am not seeing any more questions or comments. So let's go ahead and wrap up. It's a little after 2 right now anyway. So I just want to remind you that our next webinar in this Creating Sister Space series is on Thursday, same time, same link that you have. And we'll be talking about safety planning, and I'll talk about a few safety planning tools. And I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to join us today. I really appreciate that. It's nice to know there's people out there that I'm talking to. As well, I also want to just tell you that this webinar was recorded, and when the National Council has that prepared, they will send that to Redwin, and we will post it on our website. And we'll send out, most likely we're looking at probably, with the holiday coming up, we're probably looking at the first of the year. We'll get it posted on the website and make it available in case you've got a coworker or somebody else that you would like to have the opportunity to listen to this. So have a good rest of the day, and thank you all for joining us today.